World War II had an especially profound impact on the future of Germany. For decades, historians have debated how the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, may have contributed to the rise of Hitler. Some argue that the treaty was too harsh and created the conditions that allowed Hitler to gain power. Others argue that the treaty was not enforced strictly enough. Either way, after World War II, the Allies were determined not to repeat past mistakes. But they also did not trust Germany, and they needed a way to control the country without permanently punishing the German people. After World War I, the Allies sought to prevent future German aggression by disarming the country, forcing Kaiser Wilhelm II to abdicate, and requiring Germany to establish a democratic government. However, many leaders believed these measures had not gone far enough, especially after the rise of Hitler and the outbreak of a Second World War. As a result, the Allied response after World War II was much more extensive. Nazi leaders were arrested and put on trial at Nuremberg, where many were sentenced to prison or execution for war crimes. Germany itself was placed under direct military occupation and divided into 4 zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Although the Allies initially discussed the possibility of eventually reunifying Germany, growing tensions between the Western powers and the Soviet Union soon made cooperation impossible. By 1946, the emerging Cold War had destroyed hopes for a shared plan, setting Germany on the path toward permanent division. By 1947, American leaders had concluded that the struggle with the Soviet Union would be a long-term challenge. In response, President Harry S. Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, declaring that the United States would support nations resisting communist expansion through economic and military aid if necessary. Truman's policy was aimed first at Greece, where communist forces were fighting a civil war, and Turkey, which faced growing pressure from the Soviet Union. By providing money, equipment, and military advisors to both countries, the United States took its first major step toward a policy of containment, the effort to prevent communism from spreading to new regions of the world. Even more significant than the Truman Doctrine was the Marshall Plan, introduced by Secretary of State George C. Marshall in June 1947. Recognizing that economic hardship could fuel political extremism, the United States provided billions of dollars to help rebuild the war-torn economies of Western Europe. The goal was not only recovery, but also stability. American leaders believed that prosperous nations would be less vulnerable to communist influence. The plan played a major role in Europe's economic revival, helping prevent widespread poverty and political unrest. The Soviet Union, however, rejected Marshall Plan aid and barred countries under its influence from participating. As a result, the program strengthened the economies and ties of Western Europe, while Eastern Europe remained under Soviet control, deepening the divide between the two halves of the continent. As Cold War tensions deepened, the temporary division of Germany became permanent. In 1949, the United States, Britain, and France merged their occupation zones to create the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. Later that year, the Soviet Union responded by establishing the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, in its occupation zone. What had begun as a temporary arrangement after World War II had now hardened into the formal division of Germany into 2 rival states, reflecting the broader split between the Western and Soviet blocs. In 1949, the Western Allies took a major step to contain Soviet influence by creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. This military alliance united the United States, Canada, and several Western European nations in a pledge of mutual defense. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. NATO was designed to deter Soviet aggression, protect Western Europe, and ensure a lasting American military presence on the continent. It quickly became the cornerstone of the Western Alliance during the Cold War and remains one of the world's most important security organizations today. By 1950, the Cold War had expanded beyond political and economic competition into armed conflict. When North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea, the United States intervened under the authority of the United Nations to defend the South. As the fighting intensified, China entered the war on North Korea's side, turning the conflict into a major international confrontation. The Korean War demonstrated that the Cold War was a global struggle, not just a European one. It showed that ideological rivalry between communism and capitalism could lead to direct military conflict, and signaled that future confrontations between the superpowers would often be fought through regional wars around the world. By the early 1950s, Europe had solidified into two rival blocs. In the West, democratic governments with capitalist economies aligned themselves with the United States and were supported by initiatives such as the Marshall Plan and the NATO alliance. In the East, communist one-party states remained closely tied to the Soviet Union, with their political and economic systems shaped by Moscow's influence. Across Eastern Europe, Stalin enforced strict communist rule, suppressing political opposition and tightly controlling economic life. The division that Churchill had warned of was now a reality. The Iron Curtain separated Europe into two hostile camps, marking the full emergence of the Cold War order that would dominate international relations for decades.